Back in time, and throughout all of history, if you had mental illness, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that you were scourged by God. You had sinned for some reason, and because of that sin, your punishment was this mental illness that you had, whether it was considered a possession, whether it was considered an outcasting of society. If people had depression, if people had all those kind of things, would be skirted out of society and excluded. Because it was considered a scourge from God, you were also punished. And so they would have pestilence houses that were initially used to treat the sick and keep them away, but also used to house the criminals and the mentally ill. And in the United States especially, we would have the Eastern State Penitentiary, okay, where this was built into Philadelphia in 1820. And when people had these houses that were done for the criminals, they actually lowered the door frames, and they would have archways that would go through it, and the only way you were allowed to go through was on your knees. The idea, as the penitentiary states, is that you were penitent. You had to get on your knees and humble yourself before God to show your restitution and to show that you were improving and getting back towards society. Afterwards, they realized we don't need to treat people this way, and we should have safe houses for mentally ill. These safe houses were called asylums, usually set up by churches, very well-meaning to take people aside. The problem is, how do you treat the mentally ill? If it's not a sin, is it a medical condition? Is it a psychological condition? Are those two the same, or are they different? They would do experimentations and they would do heavy medication. Okay? Then it would lead towards clandestine areas where people were put into a comatose or catatonic state. They would eventually get underfunded, and then they would go into complete disrepair. Now we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud came along, and he said, you can actually psychoanalyze these people. And if you psychoanalyze them, you can actually develop a way to repair people without using necessarily heavy medication. Okay? But you can actually fix a lot of the problems that they have. But at the time, there was potions, there was tinctures, and they wanted the cure-all, they wanted the catch-all, and they finally found it. Back in Germany, at the time, they had a couple of different ways that they went with this. Every other drug, like if you took drugs like Thorazine or these kind of medications that they were using in the insane asylums, you would have downers. Opium, alcohol, all downers. So for the first time, they actually developed uppers. Uppers were the development of methamphetamines. In a different talk, I can tell you how the drug Pervitin actually led us into World War II. The other drug that was made at the same time was by the Bayer Company, and they made a cough medicine that they named heroin. The third one was a different company made a drug out of the coca plant. And this is the one that Sigmund Freud caught on to and said, you know what, this is a catch-all. This is what I've been looking for. It's a stimulant. It'll cure nervous disorders. It'll cure insomnia. It'll cure depression. It'll cure all kinds of different things. And we can use it on everybody. As such, he writes the book Cocaine Papers. He wanted every one of his patients to be on it. He had been the first to recommend the use of cocaine in 1885. This recommendation brought serious reproaches down on me because he actually died with a very significant cocaine addiction with massive, massive withdrawals that happened as a result of it. This was picked up thereafter by John Pemberton. John Pemberton is a pharmacist. He's an American who said, you know, I can actually take this and develop from the coca plant a new recipe, and I can mix it with Damanian. I can mix it with some spices, some herbs. Alcohol is important. And I can mix it both with high-proof alcohol and wine. Mix that together with a cola nut. This is the first recipe for your Coca-Cola. Okay? And it was used for all nervous disorders. It can be taken for anything and everything. Afterwards, Asa Chamberlain took over and actually started mass marketing and started mass producing. Temperance came in. A lot of the religious groups sat there and said, hey, we don't need the alcohol. We shouldn't have the cocaine. All that needs to go away. But it was creating a euphoric effect for everybody. So how do you replace that euphoric effect without using those things? High-dose sugar and high-dose caffeine. And it still provides that stimulant, that upper effect. And here we get to the propaganda. 125 years of sharing happiness is their main group right now. But they started out and they said, it creates happiness. And in original times, okay, not original times, but back in the 1700s, when we had the development of the Enlightenment movement, does anybody know what happiness was at that time? Happiness, according to Immanuel Kant, was actually a worthy life. So if you ever ask yourself, why in the Constitution did they say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What they were saying was life, liberty, and the pursuit of a worthy life. That's what we want. That's what's going to make people worthwhile. And if you ask them, what do I want out of life? The number of people that would have raised their hands and said happiness, 0. Wasn't even a concept, wasn't a thing. Nobody would have went that way. So they wanted to mix everything that is happy with Coca-Cola. And it started out at the ballparks. People get happy when they're watching a baseball game. People get happy when they are enjoying themselves in this festive time. But remember, at the time, happiness was a very temporary state of mind. It wouldn't be 24/7. It was just during those small, brief takes. What color does Santa Claus wear? Back before 1930, Santa Claus would wear green, brown. Sometimes if you were talking to the Nordic culture, it would be blue. Okay? Once in a while, he would wear red. Okay? But very, very infrequently. These were generally the depictions of Father Christmas or Santa Claus. Coca-Cola actually came in contact with the Christmas imagery, and the first thing to do is change them to red and white to match the Coca-Cola colors. Okay? The second thing to do is fatten them up a little bit, make them jolly, and make them say ho, 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 which sounds like Coke, Coke, Coke. As they got into sponsoring various sporting activities and sporting events, okay, then they would push it even further, getting together with the Hamburger Brothers in the 1960s when they made a ready meal and said, why don't you mix your cheeseburgers with some French fries and our Coca-Cola, and we'll call it a Happy Meal. 125 years and we're just getting started, okay?